Leonard Jackson had accustomed to silence, not to the common silence, the one chooses when closing the door or turn off the TV, but to the other, the forced, the one that weighs on the concrete walls, which go into the bones and makes even the past of the time hurts. For 5 years, I lived in an isolation cell in Ironwood State Prison, where every day was identical to the previous one, except for the minutes that the chaplain Morris came to speak with him about God, forgiveness and others things. In those that Len pretended believe, it was a big man with a calm look and a deep voice. Before the orange uniform, there was taken he of the army, and before that of mechanic in a workshop little in Fresno. He had no visitors. He received no letters, just a memory it maintained standing. Eclipse, his German shepherd, didn't speak a lot with the guards. Most barely looked at. To them, he was nothing more than a number in the list of those sentenced to death. And according to the records, Leonard Jackson had murdered in cold blood Paul A. Kenneman, an influential businessman with ties in the local government. But Len never accepted that guilt, not even when it arrested, nor when the prosecutor showed the supposed tests, nor when the jury read the verdict. In the night when nobody yet he saw, clinging to the memory of Helen, his fiancée, and Eclipse, who he waited anxiously by the fence every time she arrived of the work. That dog wasn't just company, it was part of him. And even though the years it would have transformed in their dreams, Eclipse always remained the same. Young, loyal, with the eyes shining with joy at seeing him arrive. The day indicated arrive with a grayish light filtering through the narrow windows of the isolation ward. The steps of the guards, they had an almost rhythm ceremonial, while it escorted toward the final cell, the one that was a few meters from the execution chamber. I was walking without resistance, without words. I had no one to tell him goodbye. There was only made a request. I want to see Eclipse before I die. Warden Mara Batista there was heard with expression impassive, promising considerate, although everyone knew that the rules did not allow it entry of animals. However, something in the way it is, he said, in a firm but not pleading voice, with that tone they use the men who no longer have anything to lose, remained floating in the air. That night, Mara made a call that didn't appear in official records. Miles away, Helen Campbell was attending her phone without imagining what was about to happen. There was past years trying to clean her name Len, but the system closed again and again the doors. Mrs. Campbell, the prison will authorize a special visit for Leonard Jackson. May bring your dog. For a moment he thought it was a cruel joke. When he understood that it was real, the world was clouded. His heart beat so strong that I could hardly hold his phone. He didn't ask anything else. He just hung up, went out into the garden and called Eclipse in a broken voice. The dog, already with his muzzle whiter and his gait less agile, he stood up as if he had understood everything. Helen hugged with force, as if that moment sealed a silent promise between the three. They had only a few hours to get there, and they didn't plan on wasting any one second. If this part moved you, maybe it's time to share this story with someone who needs hope. As Helen settled Eclipse into his seat backside of his old SUV, another man he was also preparing to face ghosts of the past. Anton Delocroix, the detective in charge of the Jackson case, had left the homicide unit years ago, but the Len's face never disappeared from his consciousness. I had followed the orders, had obeyed the chain of command, but certain things didn't add up from the beginning. For years, ignored the doubts, until one night, seeing an old digitized file, found a detail that it ice cream, an emergency call recorded minutes before the crime, made from a number linked to Walton Green, a name that until then was carefully kept out of the case. Delocroix. I knew that playing that part meant to destroy his own career, but also I knew I had sent an innocent man to the corridor of the death. In his apartment, surrounded by papers and folders, Delocroix did something he hadn't done made in a lot time, wrote a complete statement, with names, dates and evidence that he had hidden or ignored under pressure from his superiors. He scanned everything and sent the only prosecutor in who still confident, accompanied by a brief note. "If I die tonight, it was not an accident. Check this." Then he put his coat, kept a printed copy in his pocket, and came out heading to the prison. I knew I didn't have time. If your testimony could to make a difference, I had to arrive before the execution. And while was driving under the rain, I thought in the Len's eyes during the interrogation, in how they never stopped reflecting disbelief and sadness, but never guilt. That look had haunted him for years. Tonight, finally, he was going to do something about it. Helen was driving with hands firm on the wheel, but inside I was made shreds. The road, it seemed endless, and every time I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Eclipse dozing with his snout supported in his seat, the heart is shrank. For 5 years, I had visited lawyers, collected signatures, reviewed documents. I always believed in Len, always, but the system was a wall, without cracks, and every attempt at appeal was rejected with cold technicalities. Now, he had one chance. Only one, and although he didn't know if he would make it in time, he didn't. I was going to forgive never. If not, I was trying with every fiber of his being. As he passed the poster that announced the prison 50 kilometers away, squeezed the teeth and accelerated. He didn't think stop for nothing. In the corridor of the death, the atmosphere had changed. The guards, who normally maintained a rigid attitude, seemed more nervous than usual. Warden Batista reviewed documents after his desk while the phones kept ringing. A suspension order was being evaluated by the judge of the county, but it had not yet been signed. Any time error I would be irreversible. Meanwhile, Len remained in his final cell, chained hand and foot, looking at the ceiling. With a stranger, a mixture of resignation and peace. I was no longer afraid to die. All he wanted was to say goodbye to his dog. Although out for 5 minutes, although out through a grate, I knew there was going to be no redemption, but I wanted go of the world with the only look that never there was caught, Eclipses. Outside, the rain was beginning to fall with force when Delocqua crossed his checkpoint. He had no appointment or formal authorization, but when he guard read his name, they left pass without asking. His presence did not pass unnoticed. Some officers it recognized the days of the judgment, others just do it. They looked with distrust. The detective did not stop to say hello. It was straight to Batista's office. He entered without hitting, with his face soaked and the eyes injected urgently. "I have evidence new. The Jackson case is a farce. I need talk with a judge. Now." The director it looked silently, assessing him. There was heard rumors for years, but no one had dared to confirm anything. Until that night, without say word, Batista took his phone and dialed a direct number. In less than a minute, the regional prosecutor was online. Meanwhile, in the road, Helen faced his own battle. A state patrol attempted to stop her for speeding, but she didn't slow down the march. He went down the window and shouted from the car in movement, "I'm going to the corridor of the death. I was authorized. Bring the dog. Stop me if you want. But he's dying. Today." The officer, bewildered, decided not to follow her. He had no idea if that was true, but the despair in the eyes of that woman could not be faked. Eclipse, as if she understood the gravity. At the moment, he had sat up and was looking out the window, sniffing the air, restless. A few kilometers of the prison, Helen felt the hands on her. They trembled, but I couldn't loosen now. There was something stronger than the fear pushing her toward forward. The promise of a final goodbye. Inside the prison, the minutes ticked by. The execution protocol continued standing, with the doctors preparing the equipment and the witnesses being guided towards the next room. Len had signed his final papers. He didn't ask for special food. He didn't request religious words. There was only one thing said. "If Eclipse comes, I would like see it before." The officials did not know that do with that. It didn't exist regulations for canine visits in the corridor of the death, but Batista had given an order direct. If they arrived before the injection, would allow he income of the dog under strict supervision. It was a concession humanitarian, perhaps illegal, but no one dared to discuss it. In the hallways, the murmur he ran, "They're going to let a dog in." What? What kind of history class is this? Helen stopped abruptly in front of the main entrance of the prison. He left of the car before it came to a complete stop and opened the door rear. Eclipse lowered with a clumsy jump, but with the whose energy smells something familiar. A guard approached with tense expression, but seeing her so determined, not her, stopped. "They called me. I'm Helen Campbell. This is Eclipse. We're here to see Leonard Jackson." The man nodded and spoke into the radio. Seconds later, an agent escorted her inside. Helen felt that the legs you failed, but he stood firm. He hadn't crossed half a state to surrender. In the door. When arrived at the waiting room, Batista received in person. "You have 5 minutes. He still doesn't know that you comes." Helen swallowed, stroked the Eclipse's back and, with a mixture of hope and fear, followed the director toward the corridor of the death. The sound of the keys turning in the lock was the only thing that interrupted the absolute silence of the final cell. Len, sitting in the edge of the cot, raised the look with slowness. "I didn't expect visitors. I didn't expect anything. But when the door opened and he saw Helen walk in with Eclipse at her side, something inside him broke. He said nothing. He couldn't. He just stood, shaking, and gave a step forward. Eclipse it recognized instantly. With a deep groan, laden with years waiting compressed in a single sound, the dog ran toward him and he is through on top. Len fell to his knees, hugging him with both hands, sinking his face in his fur that smelled of earth and time. He cried like no one had ever cried before. "Since I did it, they arrested him, and Helen, a meter away, too, cried in silence. The guards, they observed the scene without move. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others, they squeezed the jaw with force. Nobody I had seen something like that in years. Len didn't speak. He just mumbled. He Eclipse's name over and over again, as if that were enough to go back in time, to erase the injustice, the confinement, the betrayal." Helen approached slowly. He knelt down beside her and took the "You have to hold on, Len. They're reviewing the case. Detective Delocque is here. He brought news tests." Len looked, without fully understanding. It was too much, too fast, too impossible, but in the Helen's eyes had true, and in the presence of Eclipse there was something that neither the prison nor he fear nor the death could tear off. Pure love. For the first time in 5 years, Len, he felt that maybe, just maybe, all was not lost yet. Have you ever felt like everything was lost? Tell us your story in the comments. In the warden's office, the regional prosecutor spoke by video call with the judge of the circuit. The pressure was enormous. If they decided to suspend the execution without a solid legal basis, they could face retaliation. But Delocque persisted. He had handed over the entire file, with phone records and testimony that was never included, in his judgment, and the connection direct from Walton Green with the scene of the crime. "If we let Jackson die today, knowing this, we will be accomplices," he said, with a firm voice and the face dislocated. The judge, after a tense pause, sighed. "I grant a suspension order immediate of the execution, but this is not over. They will have to prove everything in court." At that moment, the prosecutor raised his internal red phone. Batista received the news and hung up without saying a word. Then he walked to the hallway, where Len still hugged Eclipse, and stopped in front of him. "Jackson," he said, with the softest voice that can be heard, "knew the execution has been suspended. It's not going to die today." For a moment, no one breathed. Len raised the head with slowly, incredulously. Helen let out a sobbing. Eclipse turned his snout as if also understood something important. What he said?" he stammered. Len, without letting go of the dog, Batista repeated, "There is news evidence. The judge wants to review the case. You has a second chance." Len stayed silently, processing each word, then held the eyes and supported the forehead on the Eclipse's back. "Thank you," he whispered. "It was unknown well who gives it to." He said, yes to God, yes to Helen, yes to the dog, or to all of them together. But in that moment, the cell of the death, it was no longer a place of farewells, but a space where the hope had just started breathing again. The rest of the evening was a whirlwind of movements, legal, urgent interviews, and electronic signatures. Len was returned to a regular cell, without handcuffs, without extreme surveillance. I didn't know how much time would last that truce, but for the first time in years, it didn't matter. Helen and Eclipse accompanied them to where the rules it allowed. When guard announced that they should go out, Len, he hugged Helen as if his body will remember exactly as fit with hers. "I'll be back tomorrow. You're not alone, Len," he promised she, drying herself. Tears. Before leaving, Eclipse spun around one last time and Len bent down to touch him, the head. "Thanks for waiting for me, old friend," he whispered. The door closed with a metallic click, but this time it didn't sound like a condemnation. If you having come this far, it shows that these stories matter. Comment or share this story. Up to date next, the news exploded in the means. "Execution suspended due to new tests," they said. The headlines. Radio programs, news portals. And on television channels, they resumed the Jackson case, this time with a different approach. Detective Delacroix was cited by the judge to officially declare, and his testimony removed foundations that carried hidden years. The name Walton Green emerged as a powerful shadow connected to public contracts, tampering with evidence, and the disappearance of witnesses. Everything that once seemed a closed trial was beginning to crack. Len, still from the prison, I saw the cuts and listened the radio with a mixture of anger and relief. Anger for the lost years, relief for not having been forgotten. What was in game? It was no longer just his life, it was his true. The defense attorney who had represented Len in the original trial resigned publicly, claiming to have been pressured not to pursue certain lines of investigation. In her place, a young woman lawyer called Carmen Rivas assumed the case with fierce determination. He reviewed every document, interrogated former witnesses, and found contradictions that had previously been ignored. The most revealing was an anonymous call recorded in the prison system 3 days after of Len's arrest, in which a male voice warned that the dog knew too much. That phrase, in absurd appearance, was enough to reopen the file on the Eclipse's whereabouts during the days after the crime. An independent investigator discovered that an anonymous informant had attempted to euthanize the animal, but a shelter it rescued just in time thanks to the microchip. Meanwhile, Len received every news with a mixture of hope and caution. I had learned that in the real world, the justice was not always synonymous with truth. Sometimes, interests, the money and power could mold the maid to order, but also I saw how Helen wouldn't give up, how Carmen wouldn't sleep, and how Eclipse would. I looked at it every time I visited him, as if saying, "It's not over yet." In the nights, in his new cell, I was dreaming again with his walks in the park, with the Helen's laughter, with the cheerful bark of Eclipse chasing leaves, and although I didn't know that I would say he final judge, something inside him, something that had been dormant for a long time, was beginning to wake up. It was the faith, not in the system, nor in the judges, in people who Dunant had abandoned. The preliminary hearings began in the middle of a strong media attention. Walton Green, cornered by the tests, hired an aggressive legal team that attempted to discredit every finding presented by Carmen and Delacroix. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the detective was acting out of guilt, and that the dog, yes, even the dog, was just an emotional symbol to manipulate the public opinion. But the judge did not let himself impress. He requested a complete review of all the evidence originals, including those who never showed up in her trial. Among them, a private security camera appeared, installed near the alley where it happened to crime, which had been overlooked. In that video, you could clearly see a man with the Green's complexion coming out hurriedly from the scene minutes before the police will arrive. When video was shown in the court, Len was not present. By protocol, Still was to remain in custody, but Helen was there, and Carmen too. And when termed the recording, the room was in a deathly silence. The prosecutor requested an immediate arrest. Warrant for Walton Green for obstruction of justice and premeditated murder. The judge, with stern face, the granted without doubt. Helen left running out of the room to look for a signal and call the prison. When Len, I'm listening, the news through the phone couldn't contain any crying. It wasn't just that it was done justice. It was that, for the first time in years, someone you there was believed, not out of obligation, not out of pity. They believed him because the true there was, spoken louder than all the lies. Walton Green's trial was scheduled for 3 months after his arrest. During that time, Len remained in prison, but no longer in isolation, neither in death row. He had been transferred to a cell common, with access to reading areas and, what most importantly, with regular visits. Helen went every week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Eclipse. On one of those visits, she took a photograph, ancient, the three together in the park before everything collapsed. "Do you remember that day?" he asked. Len nodded, touching the image carefully, as if afraid that the simple contact the undid. "That day I thought I had everything I needed in life," he said. Helen looked at the eyes. "And what you have. We are just repairing the path." Meanwhile, the lawyer Carmen Rivas became into a recognized figure throughout the state. Its meticulous work and its courage in standing up to a flawed system inspired others, lawyers, young people, to review closed cases. Len became a symbol of resistance, but he wasn't looking for fame or prominence. All he wanted was to clean up his name and return home. In an interview from the prison said, "I don't care if the world forgets my story. I just want the system to remember that we are not numbers, we are people, and sometimes innocent people do too fall." The words, they toured the nets like fire, and the public support grew. But Still was missing a step further, the official review of your case. If everything went well, in less than a month, Len Jackson could be officially declared innocent. The day of the final hearing arrived with a dense and contained air. The courtroom steps were packed with journalists, law students, activists for the justice and citizens common who had followed the case since the home. Len was escorted to the room with shackles light, but not in prison uniform. He wore a light blue shirt and trousers simple, borrowed by an official of the prison. Seeing him enter, Helen couldn't contain the tears. "It was the first time that I saw so outside the grey walls, although still in custody." Eclipse could not enter, but I was waiting outside, accompanied by a sympathetic officer with the history. The judge reviewed the findings, the inconsistencies of the original trial, and the evidence presented in the last few months. Then he paused for a long moment and announced, "The court finds Leonard Jackson not guilty on all counts. You remain in freedom immediate." Applause broke out in the room, something unusual in those spaces, formal. Len stayed motionless for a few seconds, as if her legs were unresponsive. Helen ran toward him and it hugged with strength. Carmen, visibly moved, also approached, and Delacroix from the bottom went down the head with a mixture of relief and redemption. The press captured the exact moment in which Len, still with the wet look, raised his eyes to the sky and muttered something inaudible. Then, as he left of the court, the image that moved the whole country, Eclipse, seeing it cross the doors, pulled the strap. It came loose from the agent and ran toward his owner with a speed that no one else can expect from a dog of his age. Len bent down and received in his arms open, while the sun was shining right above, as if the universe was also celebrating its freedom. After the trial, Len did not immediately return to his old house. That life no longer existed. Helen hosted in his small apartment while they decided what to do next. The first days were strangers. The silence was no longer concrete and metal, but was still present in the form of questions without answer, of habits that are difficult to break. Len would wake up at 5 in point, folded his blankets with military precision, and ate in absolute silence. Helen observed with patience, without pressure. Eclipse, on the other hand, seemed to have returned to the normality. He slept at Len's effete, accompanied on every walk, and barked softly whenever he stayed too long silently, as if reminding him that he already was outside, that he was no longer a prisoner. Little by little, the internal scars began to heal. Len accepted talk at a local university about his experience in the prison system. At first he refused, but Helen convinced. "Your story can save others," he said, and he had reason. In that talk, in front of an audience full of young people, Len's story, the moments more dark, but also the acts of humanity that kept alive, a letter that never arrived, a guard who gave him a cereal bar when he fainted, the voice of the chaplain Morris speaking about faith when he no longer had, finished his speech saying, "I survived because someone, a woman, a dog, and a man with consciousness, decided not to give up. I'm not a hero. I'm just a test living that the system can fail, but also can correct itself." The applause lasted for minutes, and for the first time, Len felt that his pain had served a purpose. As the weeks passed, Len and Helen resumed something resembling the life they had left behind. It was not immediate, nor perfect, but there was a solid foundation, the trust unbreakable that there was sustained during years of separation. They strolled with Eclipse by the old path from the park where they used to go before the arrest. Only now their steps were slower and their silences more loaded with meaning. Sometimes, without talk, they just sat in the same old bench, watching Eclipse sniff the bushes and chase after some butterfly. "Do you realize that we have back?" Helen asked one afternoon, with the sun going down between the trees. Len squeezed the hand. "Yes, but we are not the ourselves. We are stronger." One day, while they organized some boxes with documents and clippings from the case, Len found an unopened letter. It was from Chaplain Morris. Written weeks before the suspension of the execution, contained only one sentence: "God does not forget those who truly love." Len Hill, the eyes when reading it. It was not a religious man, never was, but that phrase, so simple and sincere, touched something deep. He decided in that moment to visit the chaplain in the prison. It was a silent reunion, without need for many words. Morris, it hugged with strength, and said, "It I knew." In that moment, he understood that some people were destined to cross paths in the right moment, and that the redemption not always comes in the form of freedom, but of human connection, of being seen, heard, believed. Following its release, various organizations defending the rights civilians approached Len to offer him psychological support, legal advice, and even financial donations. He accepted the bare minimum and rejected sensationalist interviews. "I don't want my story to become a spectacle. I didn't suffer to entertain anyone," he said firmly. However, he agreed to collaborate with an independent documentary produced by ex-convicts, with the condition that the focus was the system, not him. During the recordings showed the rejected letters, the photos of Helen that he kept folded in a piece of Bible, and the Eclipse drawings that I made to keep from going crazy. Sometimes, drawing his face was the only thing that reminded me of him who I was, he confessed to the camera. The documentary, titled Eclipse, The Light in the Runner, turned around a symbol of prison reform. Eclipse, for its part, became into a kind of local celebrity. In the square where Len used to walking along it, people came up to greet him, to take pictures, to thank him for being the invisible thread that held their owner standing. Children small it caressed, elderly you offered cookies, and veterinarians offered to check him out without cost. But the dog continued being he same, calm, attentive, and above, all deeply connected to Len. He slept in his same corner every night. He would get up when it did, and was worried if it happened a lot time alone. Helen joked, "I think he cares more about you than I do." Len responded with a tired smile. He was my hope when no one else could get in, and they both knew that was true. With her time, Len began to work with a foundation that offered free legal advice to people who had been wrongly convicted. He was not a lawyer, but his experience served as a bridge between the new cases and legal teams. I listened, testimonies, shared strategies, and above all, it conveyed something that they needed more than documents: hope. In one of those meetings, met Miguel, a young African-American imprisoned since the age of 17 for a crime without solid evidence. When listening his history, Len felt a familiar echo. "I can't promise you that you will leave tomorrow," he said, "but yes, I can promise you that you will not fight alone." That phrase, repeated by Miguel in a letter years later, he became in the motto of the foundation. On a wall, next to the entrance, they hung a photograph of Len and Eclipse with the recorded phrase, "Below." Helen, for her part, decided to write a book about experience. She wasn't a writer, but her words flowed with the strength of whom has loved in half of the pain. Titled the work, "While is a Bark," and in she narrated not only the facts of the case, but the emotions, the silences, the looks that they held in the worst days. The book was published by a small local publishing house, but soon called the attention readers throughout the country, especially women who also had loved someone unjustly accused. Helen received letters, emails, and hugs in the street. But his greater reward followed seeing Len sleeping peacefully with Eclipse at his feet. "After everything we went through," he said in interviews, "I didn't write a book. I just wrote how you survive when you truly love." In the second anniversary of his liberation, Len was invited to give a talk in the same prison where he had been locked up. He hesitated, not out of fear, but because of what it meant to return to that place. But Helen and Carmen encouraged. "Your presence there does not represent the past, but the change," he said Carmen. So she accepted. When entered through the main door, it accompanied by 2 different guards, this time as a guest, not an inmate. He walked through the corridors that I knew by heart, but each step it felt different. Upon arriving at the internal auditorium, more than 100 inmates were waiting. Some it remembered, others had only his history. Len stood in front of them, took a breath, and spoke without papers. "I'm not here to tell you that everything will be okay. I'm here to tell you that if you they have someone who believes in you, are not lost." At the end of the chat, several inmates are talking to him, approached with tears in the eyes. One of them, he confessed that upon learning of his history, had decided to write a letter to his daughter after years of silence. Another asked to see a lawyer for the first time since his conviction. Len didn't promise miracles. "I only left seeds." That night, before leaving from the prison, he asked pass a moment to the cell that had been his. The guards, surprised, accepted. When it closed the door behind him, Len noticed the hard bed, the wall where it was still noticeable the shadow of the Eclipse drawing, and breathed deep. "We survived," he murmured. He didn't cry, he didn't needed. I had closed the cycle. And when I left, with the metallic sound opening behind him, he didn't look back. There was nothing left to stop him retained over there. With life more stable, Len and Helen began to talk about things that previously seemed impossible things. Buying a house together, adopting another dog, even getting married. Not by starting from scratch, but by honoring everything they had crossed. One day, while we're walking through a rural area at outskirts of the city, they found a small house with a wooden porch and a large lot full of trees. Len looked in silence for several minutes. Then he said, "Here I could breathe again." Helen said, looked with a soft smile. "Then it's here." In less than 2 weeks, they bought with part of the royalties from the book and donations received. It was the first property that Len had his name since he left prison. They painted it together, planted flowers, and placed a plaque on the entrance. Rebuilt home. Eclipse quickly adapted to its new space. He ran free, dug under bushes and took the sun in the porch, as if that place always would have been his, but also began to show signs of the time. I walked slower, slept more hours. and his vision was no longer as sharp. Len it observed with tenderness and concern. "I don't want lose it now that we are free," he said to Helen one night, stroking the sleeping dog at her feet. She took his hand. "I do not. You're going to lose. He's just getting tired, like us, but at his own pace." That night, Len stayed. I stay awake longer than usual, listening the Eclipse's slow, deep breathing. Each inhalation was a victory. Each exhalation, a promise that she would still was left time. And with every beat, I was grateful in silence, the miracle of having got there. A few months later, Helen organized a small ceremony in the garden of the house. Nothing big, just them, Carmen, Delocqua, some friends from the foundation, and of course Eclipse, which, although I no longer had the energy from before, stood firmly at Len's feet throughout the event. They married under an arch of wildflowers with a promise simple, not to promise the perfection, but the constant effort. When he, justice of the peace, declared husband and wife, Eclipse issued a soft bark as if approving the moment. The photo of the three, Len with a simple suit, Helen with a linen dress, and Eclipse with a blue handkerchief, became an emblematic image for those who followed his history, not for its aesthetics, but for what it represented, the serene triumph of love over injustice. With he pass from the years, the routine became a gift. The mornings, they were quiet, with coffee in a porch and slow walks with Eclipse. The afternoons, they dedicated themselves to writing, working in the foundation and receive visitors. Sometimes, some young lawyer or activist. I came just to listen to Len to speak, not of laws, but of humanity. The system is fixed with people, not with papers, he used to say. But also there was days difficult, especially when the memories of the confinement it attacked without warning. Helen I recognized immediately. The lost look, the long silences, the shocks nocturnal. In those moments, he sat next to her without say nothing, with one hand in his back. And Eclipse, though already old, he always came close and supported a snout in his leg. It was his silent language, and it worked. The day Eclipse didn't wake up, the whole house remained silent. Len it found lying in his favorite corner, under the window of the living room, with the head on its front paws and an expression of peace that broke his heart. There was no crying immediate, just a dense, motionless silence. Helen, covered with a soft blanket while Len knelt beside him. "Thank you, old friend," he whispered, the broken voice. "Buried in he garden, near the oak tree where I used to rest in summer. Carmen and Delocqua, they came that same day. They brought flowers, words, and silence. In the stone tablet they placed Len. He recorded a single sentence. He never stopped believing in my. That night, for the first time in a lot time, Len couldn't sleep. He paced around the house as if something more than a dog was missing. A piece of your history, of her soul. Helen it found sitting in a porch, looking at the sky. "Do you think I knew how much meant to me?" he asked. Without look at her, Helen sat down next to her. "Knew every day. That's why I waited so long, to see you free, to see you happy." Slowly, Len supported the head on his shoulder. He said nothing more. There was no need to. The void Eclipse left would never be filled. But it wouldn't go away either. He would be there, in the walks along the garden, in the photos, in the memories, and above all in the certainty that without he, Len would never have come to light. Following months were marked by a distinct calm. Len, I no longer had hurry. He walked more slowly, spoke with more pause, and dedicated hours to simple things. Reading in the sun, taking care of the flowers in the garden, write loose notes that I left stuck on the refrigerator. Some were for Helen, others for himself, same. Today I breathed without guilt. Eclipse would be proud. "Don't forget how far you've come." Helen Lars collected in a wooden box next to the bed. They were small capsules of healing. Each word, a reminder that the man who a day he was unjustly accused, now he was free, loved, and at peace with himself. Not without wounds, but yes, with meaning. One afternoon, while cleaned he shed of the background, Len found his ancient prison notebook. The there was filled with thoughts, defense schemes, and most of all, drawings of Eclipse. He sat down on a chair, dusty, and he went through page by page. There were pencil portraits with strokes trembling, small sentences written in the darkness. Hold on a little longer. Helen doesn't give up. He's waiting for me. At the end of the notebook, on the last page, there was a phrase that I no longer remembered, having written, "If any day I leave here, I will walk without chains, and he will walk with me." He closed her notebook, and it held against his chest. Then he stood up, went out into the garden, and although he was alone, he spoke out loud, "We are complying, old man." And in that moment, the wind breath with gentle force, as if responded. With he at one time, Len and Helen decided to adopt another dog, not to replace Eclipse because that was impossible, but to continue the story that he there was started. They went to a local shelter and met Luna, a mixed-breed dog with light fur and calm eyes who had been abandoned in difficult conditions. She didn't bark, she didn't move a lot, but when Len crouched down in front of her, leaned his head in his hand with a softness that disarmed. "She also knows what it is to survive," Helen said, tears in her eyes. The eyes. Luna came home that same afternoon, and although at first I was walking cautiously, he soon began to follow Len around the house as if he had already it knew before. Moon did not fill Eclipse's void, but built a new, different one. He taught Len that it was still possible to care, to give, to trust. They walked together through the path from the forest at dawn, in silence, with the cold breeze cutting through the trees and the synchronized steps. Helen them sometimes accompanied, but many others that let them go alone. It was their time. Len. He spoke little during those walks, but every now and then he whispered things to Luna, as if sharing with she thoughts that I couldn't tell anyone else, and the dog patiently I listened without move. That's how he learned to heal another part of his soul, not just by telling his history, but creating new. And Luna, without knowing it became in the guardian of that second stage, thus of the man who not only returned from the abyss, but chose to keep walking. One winter morning, while we're preparing her breakfast, Helen noticed something different in Len. It wasn't pain, nor sadness. It was something more serene, more firm. "I was thinking about visiting the Paul Kenneman's family," he said suddenly, breaking a silence that carried years. Helen looked without responding at first. I knew what it meant, that gesture. It wasn't just an act of courage, it was a way to close the circle definitively. "If you are ready, I'm going with you," he finally said. They contacted the Paul's widow, who, to both of their surprise, accepted, received them. The meeting was tense, contained. The woman, I'm listening silently, watching Len with a mixture of distrust and compassion. "I can't give back to my husband," she said at the end, "but I am grateful that they're come. That also, it takes courage." After that something changed in Len. I couldn't explain it with words, but Helen noticed. He was sleeping better. He smiled more often. He even resumed an old hobby he had abandoned decades ago, building things with wood. In his shed of the garden, he began to carve small figures, many of them inspired by dogs. Each sculpture bore a word recorded: loyalty, hope, patience, forgiveness. With her time, neighbors and acquaintances, they started asking him custom pieces, and what began as silent therapy became in a way of sharing your history without need to repeat it. "Each of these dogs represents someone who held me when everything seemed lost," he explained. And so, with his hands, Len continued transforming. Pain in memory, and memory in meaning. If you feel this message deserves to reach more people, share it. With Who Believe on Second Chances one day, the foundation it invited to participate in a pilot project within the penitentiary system. Human bonding workshops with animals for prisoners in situation of isolation. Len accepted without doubt. For months, he traveled to different prisons to talk about his history, but also to accompany the process of rescuing dogs that would be trained by Selected inmates, the impact was immediate. Where before there was hostility and distrust, bonds of affection, responsibility and purpose began to emerge. "You're not training a dog," he said, Len. "You are training yourself to feel again." Some inmates cried, others simply they nodded, but all of them, without exception, they were grateful contact with a being who did not judge, who only asked attention and returned dear. On one of those visits, Len met Samuel, a young, with a hard look but trembling hands. He had been given a black, rebellious and restless puppy to look after. At first, Samuel mocked him from the program. "What are you going to teach me?" "A dog," he said. But with time, he started to arrive earlier to the workshop, to prepare the food, to sit down in silence while the puppy was sleeping in his lap. Len, it observed with respect, without intervene too much. One day, as they were saying goodbye, Samuel approached, and he said, "Thank you for bringing something alive to this place. I thought I had nothing left to take care of." Then you put a hand on his shoulder. "While you can take care of something, you are not lost." And in with that phrase, Samuel found a new way to resist, just like Len years ago. As the years passed by, the Len's story, it stopped being news and became in reference. It no longer appeared in headlines or in interviews, but his name continued to circulate among judges, young people, law, students and human rights defenders. In universities, his case was studied as an example of a judicial ruling corrected thanks to the perseverance and the intervention citizen. To Len it was enough. I didn't need it. Public recognition, just make sure that your suffering was not in vain. They asked if he hated those who they had locked up. He replied always the same. "If I stay in hate, I'm still a prisoner. And now I was there too long there." It was his way of not letting the past dictated his future, a future that he was now building with wood, with words, and with acts of kindness. Helen, for her part, continued writing. Although, While Is a Bark was his only published book, he began to collaborate with organizations that gave voice to women who accompanied their loved ones during processes, unfair penalties. It became in mentor, in guide, in consolation. At every meeting, he repeated the same idea. It doesn't matter if they don't believe. The important thing is that you don't stop doing it. His words were balm for those who still they expected answers. Justice, or simply a sign that it was worth continuing to fight. In the country house next to the desk hung a blackboard with photos, clippings and letters from women who had read his story. Each one represented a spark of hope that had been lit, and every letter that arrived confirmed that telling their story, pain, it had been worth it. A particularly harsh winter brought with it a complication respiratory for Len. He was hospitalized for a few days, and although it was not serious, I remember being surrounded by white walls, metallic noises, and imposed routines. Removed old wounds. Helen was by his side the whole time, reading to him passages from books, taking him children's drawings of the foundation and recent photos of Luna. "You're not locked up, love. This is just a break," he told her. He repeated with softness, "Len, although he did not say a lot," he replied with a look that it said everything, profound gratitude. Upon returning home, he asked for a wooden bench to be built under the oak tree, next to Eclipse's grave. "I want a place to sit when I feel fragile but also free," she explained. And so they did. That bank became his shelter. Every time I was restless, I walked there with Luna. He sat in silence and let the wind did your part. Sometimes was wearing a book, others just closed the eyes and left pass, time. Helen it accompanied in sometimes, but also knew when leave him alone. That silent balance between company and space was one of the things they valued most about their life together. One afternoon, while the sun was setting behind the trees, Len wrote in a notebook, "There is no elderly freedom to have someone to love, a dog by your side and peace in the chest. Everything the rest, it comes and goes." That phrase, without looking for it, would end recorded on a plaque at the foot of the bench years after, when his history will become a living part of the memory of those they met. Len's last years of life. They were quiet, but never passive. He continued to set in the foundation, now from home, advising cases by video call and participating in seminars virtual. Luna, already older, slept the most of the day, but it continued getting up every time I was walking toward the door. Helen had retired from her previous job and now dedicated himself completely to the project social that both had initiated. In the community were acquaintances simply as of the Oak, and his house had become meeting point for those who will need an attentive ear, a sincere advice, or just a hot cup of coffee in the middle of a bad day. To Len, you liked that routine. No flashes, no noise, just simple life with purpose. One morning, after a particularly cold night, Helen found Len asleep in his favorite armchair with an open book on his chest and Luna at his feet. For a second he thought she was still sleeping, but as he approached, noticed the absolute calm of his face. There was no anguish, nor pain, nor urgency. Len had left as he lived his last years, at peace, surrounded by what he loved. Helen didn't scream. She didn't run. She just knelt beside him and took her hand. "Thank you for staying, for coming back, for healing with me," he whispered. Then he caressed Luna, who looked with eyes old but attentive, and although the world now felt quieter, Helen knew she was not alone. She had shared her life with a survivor, and that is never lost. The funeral was simple, like him it would have liked. Close friends and former guests attended, colleagues of the foundation, neighbors, and even some former inmates that Len there was accompanied for years. There were no grandiloquent speeches, neither long ceremonies, just words shared under the oak tree, next to the bench where he used to sit down. Helen read a fragment of the letter that he there was left prepared years ago. "If you are reading, this is because I left in peace. Don't cry for me. Live with more compassion, with more patience, and never underestimate what a dog can do for a broken soul." They released laughter through tears, and when his coffin was taken down to the earth, Moon approached the edge and emitted a soft moan like a goodbye from the depths. Days later, Helen organized her garden with care as if each flower were a tribute. He planted daisies by the grave, loving again after from the abyss. It was about walking again, even though everything hurt. And as he closed the notebook, looked up at the sky and smiled, because even though his body were no longer there, Len continued walking with her, in every step, in every silence, in every memory, with he. As the months passed, Helen became the Oak House in a small memory and accompaniment center. Didn't made public, neither it registered as a foundation, simply let the door open to those who, they arrived with a story that hurt. In his shed, where Len carved wooden shelves were placed with his sculptures, books, and photographs. Each figure had a handwritten label, for Samuel, who trusted again, for Carmen, who never stopped, for Eclipse, who never gave up. And next to the entrance, a simple sign, he said, "Here we believe on second chances." There was no schedules, no appointments. People arrived, sat down in silence or talked for hours. Some would leave crying, others smiling for the first time in a lot time. One day, a young woman arrived with a folder under its arm and the eyes full of fear. She introduced herself as Clara and barely crossed the door, broke in crying. Helen didn't ask anything. She prepared him fabric, sat in a porch and waited. When Clara finally spoke, it did with words run over. Their brother had been wrongly convicted, and no one wanted to take the case. There was ear talk about Len, about his history, and thought that maybe, just maybe, they would find something different. Helen took the folder, looked calmly, and said, "The only thing I could say in that moment, Len is not there, but what he began is still alive. Let's read this together." And in that phrase, Clara found what I needed most, company, because sometimes justice begins simply by being heard. From that moment on, meeting with Clara, Helen resumed with more force the purpose that he had shared with Len. He started receiving more cases, reading files, connecting. With Carmen's former colleagues already formed a small, informal network of legal and emotional support. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew listen, accompany, translate he language cold of the justice to human words. With he time, some lawyers' youths began to frequent the house, not for money, neither prestige, but by conviction. They carried their laptops, shared progress, and, between coffee and silence, they knitted a new kind of justice. One that was just beginning in her garden of a simple house, at the foot of an oak tree that had witnessed too many goodbyes and even more beginnings. Moon, now old woman, she continued being an essential part of that routine. Although I was walking with difficulty and passed much of the asleep all day, she stayed close whenever someone new arrived, as if his mere presence offered consolation. One afternoon, when a desperate young man told between sobs as they had sentenced their cousin without clear evidence, Luna crawled to him and supported his snout on his shoe. The boy stayed motionless and then broke in a crying deeper, different. Helen said nothing. She just offered a handkerchief and him poured more tea, because already I knew that sometimes the first step toward the justice was not an appeal, not a single complaint. It was that someone, person or dog, touched your soul without asked questions. With he passed of the time, Helen's house became legend among those who were looking for silent justice. I had no sign, no social networks, no schedules, but always there was someone there. One afternoon could have a lawyer reviewing a case in his garden, a woman reading letters under the porch, or a student interviewing Helen for a job college student. Everyone found something. Sometimes it was just a respite, sometimes a direction, sometimes the strength to try again. Helen called Len's echo, because according to her, her voice lived on in every gesture, every decision, every story that didn't give up. There was even a wall in his warehouse where visitors left phrases. Some were anonymous, others were signed, all were sincere. One day, while cleaned the library, Helen found a recording ancient in an old USB labeled Final Testimony. It was Len, sitting in front of the A-Friend's camera, talking with his calm tone and that look that he said everything without need to raise the voice. "If you are watching this," he said, "maybe you're looking for an answer. I have, but I learned that sometimes it's not about finding justice perfect. It's about not giving up, keeping searching. And if you ever think you're alone, think in a dog that waited 5 years without losing the faith." Helen stopped her video and closed the eyes. He breathed deep. Then it copied and it left ready to share with who it will need. Because some truths don't die. They're just waiting to be heard in the right moment. Helen was getting older, but her spirit did not lose firmness. He walked slower, yes, but every step continued loaded with intention. Moon, already very weakened, she passed almost all of the time lying next to the oak bench, where now a small additional plaque read, "Here rest those who never gave up." The visits continued, some brief, others prolonged. Young, old, adults, all carried with them an invisible weight. Helen received with the same warmth as always, as if he knew every wound beforehand. Sometimes, after long conversations, he would write something in his after-the-bark notebook. It was his way to not forget, to not allow things to happen. Stories were lost in the noise of the world. Each word was a ribbon with he past, and a seed for the future. Did you get this part? Maybe it's time to follow this page for more stories. So, one night, when it was clear and the stars shone with unusual clarity, Helen led Luna to the porch and they sat together. They didn't speak, as was customary between the two. They just shared the cold air, the creaking of branches, and the distant echo of some song in the radio. Helen stroked the Luna's head with trembling hands and whispered, if you leave too, I will know that we have fulfilled our part." That morning, Luna fell into a deep sleep and never woke up. She was buried next to Eclipse, under the oak tree, and Helen planted a white flower between the two graves. "Loyalty also leaves roots," he wrote on a stone, and from that day, the garden had a different silence, full of absence, but also of peace. With her time, Helen stopped receiving visitors with the same frequency, not because I would no longer want to, but because the body was beginning to impose its limits. Even so, it never closed the door completely. It continued answering letters. I read every email printed that the neighbors they brought her, and she spent hours sitting under the oak, reading aloud, fragments of books or stories of old cases, just in case anyone listened, he said. One day, a young local journalist approached him for an interview. "I want to tell your complete story," he said. Helen smiled with sweetness. "It's not mine, darling, it's ours, and it's already written on every person who's passed through here." Even so, he accepted talk, and for days, they reviewed each chapter of their lives with Len, Eclipse, Moon, and the garden that they saw rebuild. The Daoxiu interview was published under the title "The Home Where the Justice Blooms." It didn't take long and go viral. People from all over the country began sending messages, gifts, words of thanks. Helen remained distant of the bustle. He only left a public response, brief and clear. "Thank you for remembering, not for me, but for all those who still they wait justice." In a photograph that accompanied his report, it is I saw sitting in the bench under the oak, with the gaze lost in the horizon, and a hand resting on a closed book. It was a serene, powerful image, and many they said it looked like a postcard from the closing of a cycle. Helen, without look for him, had become his living testimony that the dignity, the loyalty and love could sustain a whole life. Years afterwards, when Helen was no longer there, the Oak House was inherited by a group of volunteers who had worked alongside her in recent times. Not the transformed-in museum, neither in official foundation. They respected his essence, an open, warm place where each story had space and every silence was valid. They maintained the bench, the plaques, the sculptures of Len, and the Helen's notebook. They also kept the letters that she there was received, classified by name, year, and predominant emotion: hope, pain, faith. The only new thing they added was a little mailbox under the entrance sign. It read, "Tell us your story. Here nobody judges you." And in a few months, already was full. Every now and then, someone left a letter addressed to Len, others times to Eclipse. There was even children's drawings that talked about Luna without to have it known. The story, in some way, had become turned legend, but not one of those that are forgotten between the pages of books. It was a living legend, shared by word of mouth, in universities, in courts, in animal shelters. "Do you know the history of the man who survived because of his dog?" they asked. Some, and so on. Stories began that ended always with the same idea, that even in the darkest place, love, the truth, and the loyalty, they can open a crack through which it enters the light. And in that crack, Len there was left his footprint, one that neither neither they were able to erase the oblivion. With the years, the Len's story, it was adapted into school plays, performances theatrical and documentary independent, never for commercial purposes, always with respect. At one of those school functions, a 10-year-old boy, years old, stood up at the end and said in front of everyone, "I want to be like Eclipse. I want to take care of someone until they smile again." The teachers looked at each other, moved. They had taught dozens of topics, but that one day knew that something different had taken root. It wasn't just a story of injustice righted, it was a testimony of emotional resilience. How love doesn't scream, it doesn't demand, it just remains. And how, sometimes, a silent presence is enough to hold someone on the edge of the abyss. At a law school, a teacher placed Len's photo hugging Eclipse in the first class of the year. He didn't explain anything. He just said, "If you want to know why I chose this profession, look at this image. Each one of you, in some time, You're going to have the possibility of being the reason for the which someone doesn't give up. The students, they remained silent. Some did not know the history, others yes, but never the had seen from that angle. That image, so simple and so powerful, it was projected throughout the class. And it was just like, without speeches, without embellished phrases, Len continued speaking, through gestures, through echoes, through the example of someone who lost everything and still so chose not to give up. On a special occasion, on the occasion of the anniversary of his release, was organized a low-key event in the city where he had lived. It was not an institutional tribute nor a political ceremony. It was a meeting community with neighbors, former colleagues of the foundation, students, and people who once received aid in the Oak House. Photos of Len, Eclipse, and Helen were placed among trees adorned with soft lights. Each guest could leave a note hanging on a rope that crossed He Garden. Some, they said, "Thank you for teaching me not to give up." Others simply, "Me too, I am waiting for justice." At the end of the event, the following were read out loud fragments of After the Bark, the Helen's notebook. And although nobody cried outrageously, they all came out different, as if something invisible and firm would have touched inside. In that same night, a girl with curly hair and an intense look approached a volunteer and asked, "Eclipse was a real dog or an angel disguised?" The volunteer smiled, crouched down to her level and replied, "Maybe it was both things." The girl, she nodded, convinced, and left a drawing hanging. On the rope, a man's silhouette walking next to a dog under a darling starry. That image was among the most memorable of the event. It didn't need words. It was the visual summary of everything that history meant. And while the lights went out and the garden was left silently, someone, he whispered, "There are stories that never end. They just rest in the hearts where they left root." And all, in at that moment, they knew that Len continued there, in every step, in every note, in every bark that echoed in memory. Past a time, a young independent filmmaker decided to record a movie based on In the Len's story. He didn't use any big actors, neither effects specials. Filmed in scenarios real, with real people, and with a rescued dog who had an expression almost identical to Eclipse. The film did not win awards. International neither had great distribution, but it was projected in community centers, schools, and prisons. At each screening, there was absolute silence. At the end, instead of applause, there was often have hugs. People who had not spoken to each other before came closer to share their history. And that was, in words of the director, the true happy ending. Not one on screen, but one of a transformed life. Because sometimes what changes the world isn't a big production, but a truth bliss with he heart. In a prison from the north of the country, after one of those projections, an inmate asked the word, "Me too, I have an eclipse," he said, while showed the photo of a dog that I expected at home. And while he waited for me, I will resist. The room was left in silence. That man, with a trembling voice and hands marked by the routine of the prison, he had just said what thousands they felt and could not express. And in at that moment, everyone understood that the Len story wasn't just about him. It was about them, about anyone who was ever lost and found in the silent love of another being. The strength to continue. And so, with each screening, each talk, each letter, the history, she was still alive. Not as a memory, but as a beacon. With the years, the figure of Len was incorporated in training manuals for police, judges and prosecutors as an emblematic case of a reversed miscarriage of justice. Not as a warning, but as a call to action, humanity within the system. "Remember that behind every file there is a life," was the phrase that headed her chapter. That sentence, written by Helen in one of her endnotes, summed up what they had learned with pain and patience. In conferences, some prosecutors, they began by quoting that line, and in courtroom corridors, where the coldness used to reign, His history opened spaces for reflection. What if this is our next Len? Was sometimes heard, a tone I wasn't looking for guilty, but conscience. In an animal shelter of the city, they placed a special plaque with a picture of Eclipse. Beneath it, a simple text: "The dog who waited, the dog who saved." It was a tribute, small but constant. Every time someone adopted a dog, he has counted the Eclipse story, not as an obligation, but as an inspiration. Not all heroes. They have a cape, he said. The manager. Some just need a leash and a faithful heart. The children listened attentively. The adults were silent, and many of those adopted dogs were then names like Light, Wait, or even Eclipse, in honor of the German shepherd who had shown the world that a bark could be more powerful than a verdict. In a little town of the south, a teacher decided to use the story of Len and Eclipse as the final activity of the year. He asked his students to write letters as if they were Len, Helen, or the Eclipse itself. The results deeply moved. One of the children, who used to have difficulties in expressing himself, wrote, "I am Eclipse, and I don't understand why my human doesn't come anymore, but I still do it. I'm going to wait, because he taught me not to give up." The letter was read in the end-of-year ceremony, and many parents came out with tears in the eyes. It was so when the teacher understood that beyond of the curricular content, there was planted something deeper, empathy, and all thanks to a true story that had crossed borders without love. In other city, an elderly woman advanced, took his grandson to visit the garden where they rested Len, Eclipse, and Luna. They were read Helen's book many years before, and wanted to show the child a place where love had conquered hopelessness. He walked slowly among the trails that told the history with their own words, and when they reached the bench, they sat down together. The boy, curious, asked, "What if a day I feel sad? I can come here." The grandmother smiled and said, "Always, because this is not a place to remember sorrows. It is a place to remember that even in the darkness bigger, someone may be waiting for you," with the tail wagging, and the child, without say nothing more, supported his head in her shoulder, as if already it understood everything. With his time arose hundreds of versions of the history. Some changed details, others added fictitious elements, but in everyone's heart remained intact message: the loyalty can save lives. On social media, every so often at one point, an image of Len and Eclipse embracing reappeared, with phrases like, "The dog who waited," or "Love is not imprisoned." People from different countries commented, shared, and wrote as that history they had touched. Some they used to talk about justice, others to honor their own animals, but they all agreed in one thing. Something in that history there was made stop, breathe, and remember what really matters. A philosophy professor wrote an essay titled "Eclipse and the Ethics of the Bond," where he analyzed the history as a modern metaphor for unconditional commitment. He said that Eclipse represented the purest form of fidelity, that which does not need evidence, neither promises, just presence. He waited 5 years without knowing if I would see him again, and yet so he did not hesitate, he wrote. That text was read in universities and conferences, not only as an academic reflection, but as a testimony of how a real fact can illuminate abstract concepts. And so, without wanting it, Len and his dog ended up leaving a mark not only in the justice, but also in the philosophy, literature, and pedagogy. Years after, in the 20th anniversary of the Len's release, was organized a national meeting of defenders of the unjustly convicted. It was held in the same city where everything was started. The event was called the Eclipse Light. It was not just a tribute, it was a reaffirmation of principles, to believe in the possibility of redemption, of truth, of restored justice. Helen was gone, but her name was recorded in every speech. Various and ex-convicts, they talked about how the Len's story had been her beacon. A woman, he said, "When nobody believed in me, I thought in Eclipse, and that it was enough to hold on for a while, one more day." It was so when someone he proposed, to applause, to create a national support network with the Eclipse's name. And so was born a motion. That movement, Red Eclipse, began helping with consultancies legal, but soon expanded to provide emotional support, temporary housing for families of prisoners, and therapeutic visits with animals to prisons and hospitals. In the main headquarters, there was a mural with the three key figures. Len with his serene expression, Helen writing in his notebook, and Eclipse with the head raised and the attentive eyes. That mural was painted by young people from a socio-educational center. One of them, upon finishing it, wrote at the bottom, "I didn't know any of them, but I feel like they saved me." Because sometimes stories don't need eyewitnesses to make effect. It is enough for someone to count with truth, and Len's story kept being told over and over again, like a flame that never goes out. In an intimate ceremony, years afterwards, a life-size sculpture of Eclipse was placed in his original oak garden. It was sculpted in bronze, with a detail touching. The dog is depicted looking towards the entrance of the house, as if still waiting for the arrival of Len. At the foot of the sculpture, an inscription. Simple, he said. Here waited, here came back, here healed. Children of the neighborhood. They left flowers, drawings, even croquettes at the foot of the figure. It was more than a statue. It was a symbol of what it means to wait for love, without guarantees, only with faith. And who it visited? Many sometimes they stayed silently, caressing the cold metal, as if they could feel it as some of the heat that Len had felt when I hugged him for the last time. Little by little, the history was transcending generations. Children of those who they met Len grew up listening his story. Some they read in school books, others it heard as an urban legend. But in all cases, the emotion was the same. Dad, and you, that, what would you do if you were accused of something you didn't do? He asked. A child. I would look for my Eclipse, he replied his father. That phrase, so simple and so loaded with meaning, began to circulate as part of a national campaign against errors, judicial, a find your Eclipse. It was not a literal call. It was an invitation not to give up, to search for that thing, person, cause, faith, truth that will keep you strong even when all seems lost. Exactly as it did Len. With he passed from the years, the story of Len, Helen and Eclipse was translated into several languages. Organizations international that they used as an example in lectures on human rights, animal welfare and resilience. A play was written in Japan, inspired by the history, a short film in Brazil, and even a graphic novel in France. In each version, the details changed, but the core remained. The silent struggle of someone unjustly accused, the strength of whom loves him unconditionally, and loyalty unbreakable of a dog that became in symbol. In one of those presentations, one spectator commented at the end, "It is the most human story I have known." And the protagonist doesn't speak. Meanwhile, the Oak House continued standing, cared for by new generations. It was no longer just a refuge, but a space for training, art and memory. In one of the workshops for young people, a teenager wrote a poem titled, He came back because they waited. It was read out loud by a colleague, and when finished, no one applauded. Everyone was silent, moved. One of the coordinators of the workshop scored in his notebook, "We continue sowing without make noise, like Len, like Eclipse." And in that intimate act, it became clear that the story was not over. Because while someone will find in she the courage to move forward, the legacy of those three would still be alive, not as a myth, but as a profoundly human truth. One sunny afternoon, many years after all, a group of elementary school children visited the Oak House as part of a school trip. The volunteers them. They counted the history with language simple, adapted to their ages. They talked about Len, about how was unjustly accused, of Helen, who never stopped believing in him, and Eclipse, the dog who waited for years. The children, they listened with attention, some with the eyes very open, others asking curious questions. In the end, one of them raised his hand and asked, "And what passed when Len came out?" The guide. He smiled and replied, "Len didn't just leave. He came back to life." And in that moment, everyone seemed to understand that the true ending was not the freedom, but everything that came after. After the visit, the children, they wrote letters to leave in his mailbox next to the oak tree. One read, "Dear Len, when I grow up I want help people like you." Another, shorter one, just said, "Thank you for not giving up." A third, signed in shaky handwriting, said, "Me too, I have a dog waiting for me at home. Her name is Sul, and now I understand how important it is." The volunteers. They read each one with the same respect with which Helen read the letters years ago, because they knew that their between colored sheets and simple phrases, was a silent continuation of a legacy that never asked for applause. Only truth, hope, and the certainty that every life can be rebuilt if someone chooses to wait for it. In a not-so-future distant, one of the grandchildren of a volunteer decided to do his final high school project on the Len's story. I didn't knew, but had grown hearing his name with respect. He interviewed former collaborators, read the books, reviewed documents, and visited his Garden of the Oak on more than one occasion. His presentation was titled, "Waiting is Not Being Still." She explained how Eclipse had not only been a faithful dog, but the catalyst for a chain of human acts that transformed lives, institutions, and consciences. It ended his exposure saying, "There are those who save lives with uniforms, others they bark silently. Eclipse taught us that waiting, when it's filled with love, can move the world." That phrase was so powerful that its teacher the printed and hung up in his hall. From then on, every year the new students, they asked, "Who was it, Eclipse?" And so, once again, the history was being told again, not from the pain, but from the inspiration, not as a tragedy, but as an intimate victory, woven in silence and resistance. And although time still its course and the names were gradually fading away among new ones' generations, the echo of that bond continued to cross classrooms, gardens, homes, because while had someone willing to listen, someone else would be willing to tell. And that was the true eternity of Len, Helen, and Eclipse. Decades later, when already nobody remained of the original generation, a group of young people activists found a full file of the digitized history in a community library. They read in a group, as if it were a novel, and were surprised to discover that it was real. That man, the woman, and that dog had existed, fought, and resisted. They decided to restore the Oak House, which was somewhat deteriorated, and open it again as a space of memory and accompaniment. They did not change almost nothing. They maintained the bench, the plates, the mailbox, and they even found a box with original writings by Helen and a notebook with drawings made by Len in prison. They called it the Living Archive, and allowed any visitor to read, touch, leave something of yours. One day, an 11-year-old girl, years later, folded piece of paper next to the Eclipse sculpture. It read, "Dear Eclipse, my dad is sad. I don't know as help him. Can you teach me to wait like you?" The message was found by a volunteer who it placed in a special display case next to other letters that arrived with regularity. And so, without social networks, without advertising campaigns, without noise, the history followed beating. Because what is built with love, without intention of fame, endures. Eclipse was not just a dog. It was a bridge between a broken man and his freedom, between a woman tireless and his hope, between generations that may never meet, but will continue believing that the fidelity, the truth, and silent love still can change the world. A centenary after of the day in which Len was released, a rural school organized a ceremony in their honor. They had no allot budget, nor large resources, but there were read his history in an old copy of the graphic novel based in his life. The students, they planted a tree in her patio, that they put Eclipse's name, and next to it they placed a stone painted with the phrase, "To wait is also to love. There were no press or authorities, just children, teachers, and a principal with tears in the eyes. One of the students read a text that I had written for the occasion. I didn't know Len, but I want to be like him. Not because it was strong, but because it did not become bad when the world was unfair. There was silence. Then, a sincere, brief, soft applause. That same day, in another part of the world, a rescued dog entered prison for the first time as part of a reintegration program. His name was Pharaoh, and his caretaker, a man with years of condemnation on his shoulders, crouched down in front of him and said, "I'm going to take care of you like Eclipse took care of Len." No one you had asked for that phrase. Nobody I knew if there was read the history, but someone took it had counted. And that was enough, because the stories, true stories, are not only transmitted through books or screens, they live in the gestures, in the looks, in the words that are said when nobody is recording. And the Len's story continued there, not written, but lived, a flame that passed from hand to hand without never turn off. Time after, in an international congress on restorative justice, a young woman speaker started his presentation projecting an image, Len hugging Eclipse, right in the moment in which they reported that their execution had been suspended. The auditorium. She remained silent. She did not say his name at the beginning, only related the history as it is there was heard from your grandmother, who once volunteered at the Oak House, finished with a reflection simple. This image does not show a man saved. It shows a man who never stopped being worthy, and a dog who stayed to remind him of it. The applause came afterwards, but what remained floating in the atmosphere was somewhat stronger, the certainty that this history already belonged to the world. In the margins of its presentation, many attendees, they wrote down just one word, Eclipse. For some, it was a symbol of resilience, for others, of hope, and for many, a silent guide in through hostile systems. Why Eclipse didn't save Len with speeches or heroism, saved by being, waiting, resisting without make noise. And that gesture, so simple, so powerful, it became a mirror where many, they began to look at each other. In the years following, more institutions, they began to incorporate animals in emotional support programs, many of them directly inspired in that example. Without knowing it, Eclipse had open roads that neither the most expert legislators could imagine, and what there was made without say a single word. In a small second-hand bookstore, a teenager found a worn copy of While is a Bark. He browsed through it out of curiosity, but soon stood still, the eyes fixed on an underlined page. We do not survive by being strong, but by not ceasing to believe that someone, in somewhere, it still awaits us. He bought the book with the few coins he had and took home as if will load a treasure. Days later, he wrote in his diary, "I don't know if any day I will have an eclipse, but if someone needs me, I want to be so I." That decision, silent and without witnesses, changed the manner what he looked at the Yao world, and with time too the manner in which he acted in other corner from the country. A woman elderly decided donate his time to an animal shelter after reading about Len. When interviewed by a volunteer, she said with a smile, "I'm not here to save dogs. I'm here to let them save me like they did with he." He had never met Len, nor Helen, nor Eclipse, but his history there was arrived the same way they arrive the things that are born of the soul. And so every act small, a walk, a caress, a warm blanket, it was part of that chain invisible kindness that had begun years before, with a man kneeling in a floor, hugging his dog, and finally hearing that his life would be forgiven. Today, if you walk through the garden where they rest Len, Eclipse and Moon, you will see that there is no marble, nor mausoleums, nor imposing statues, just a wooden bench, a simple plaque, and a dirt path surrounded by flowers. But if you sit a moment and you close the eyes, you can feel something. It's not sadness, it's something more serene, the memory of a story that was told with truth, lived with courage and sustained by the tenderness of a dog who never stopped hoping. The birds they sing, the leaves creak, and sometimes the wind blows as if caressing your back. In that place, it invisible becomes present, and the simple, sacred, because this is not just the story of a man who escaped from the death, it is the story of how a dog, a woman, and a repentant detective challenged the system. Len not only recovered the freedom, recovered his dignity, his name, and finally a second chance at life. And in his final walk alongside Eclipse and Helen, in his path, where they used to walk before everything fell apart, Len was not an ex-convict. He was a survivor. And that silent walk in the sun was the more compelling proof that even in the darkest place, the loyalty, love, and true can make way for light. If this story touched your heart, honor his memory by leaving a comment or share it with someone who needs believe again.